So today I'm speaking with Kelle Horn from Pacific Rim Shipbrokers. And hello, Kelle.
Hi, Ross. Great to be here.
I'm happy to speak with you today. I was hoping you could give us a little background about your experience in the shipping industry.
Absolutely. So my name is Kelle Horn. I'm with Pacific Rim Shipbrokers. We're a dry bulk ship brokerage out in the Pacific Northwest in the Seattle area. We're on a small island called Bainbridge. The company was started in 1984, and we purchased it from the original owners in 2016. Two other employees and I really loved what we did. We loved working together, and we decided just because they were retiring, we didn't want Pac Rim to stop. And just sort of anecdotally, we're the only all-women-owned ship brokerage firm in the United States, as far as we know, especially within dry bulk. So that's a little feather in our cap. And then we also do some work with the government where we actually do charter vessels. But primarily our bread and butter is in dry bulk and in brokerage of the minor bulks, geared vessels primarily, although we do have some Panamax business as well. And I've been in the industry since 2001, so I've seen some real big highs and lows. And one of the greatest things about dry bulk and shipping in general is it's never dull.
I would second that. Could you explain a little bit about minor bulk versus major bulk and what exactly those terms mean?
Sure. So the minor bulks tend to be everything outside of grain, coal, and iron ore. The major bulks are those three, and they tend to be on the larger vessels where you're seeing the capes, baby capes, and Kamsarmaxes and Panamaxes as well. But the major bulks, they are a very unique industry, especially, I would say, iron ore in particular, where they have fewer ports that they're calling. These very large vessels can only go in and out of certain ports, and although it does, especially the capes, pull our indice, which is called the BDI or the Baltic Dry Index. It pulls our indexes around, but really the minor bulks, everything else that you can imagine that's dry from lintels to scrap metal, are the day in, day out sort of venerable cargoes that are pushed around the planet. They go into almost everything that we use.
Certainly. Now, you mentioned geared bulkers in there. What exactly differentiates a geared vessel?
Right. So when you're looking at a vessel, if you happen to notice one out in a port near you, you might see one that's very flat and long, and it has the house, as we call it, where the crew stays in the back. And there's nothing else in there. There's big holes that open up, hatches that open up, and cargo is poured in using only shore equipment. And a geared vessel, you would see the same sort of shape of the vessel, but it will have cranes on it, typically 4 cranes or more, depending on the size of the vessel. We are down to 2, and those cranes are able to assist in the loading and discharging of the cargo. They aren't always used, but that's where it's really beneficial for those smaller ports or ports that don't have the infrastructure or the gear to discharge and load cargo. So you might put a big clamshell on and you're scooping out grain and putting it into direct hits into trucks, or you're putting a big shovel on it to load scrap metal off of the deck.
Okay. Now, I understand starting in 2021, there was a connection between container ship markets and specifically geared bulkers. I was curious if you could speak a little bit about that.
Sure, that was a very, very unusual situation. Typically, bulkers in almost all the contracts will say specifically no containers, or maybe they might allow on a special occasion a couple of containers on deck after the bulk cargo is loaded. Well, when containers got up to $25,000, $30,000 a container, suddenly bulkers and the fact that they had gear and they could load said containers became a viable option for those looking to get their containerized cargo. It is not without some complications. All of those owners who did decide that they would try and break into that market had to have class come and all kinds of things to happen to make sure the trim and stability of the vessel could be maintained. But those cranes proved quite important in being able to load and discharge the containers when they were going into the ports, because a typical container crane was not going to be as easily manipulated into the smaller ships and non-container vessels or Panamaxes. And that was a real gold mine for a lot of the minor bulkers, when maybe not necessarily as much steel or scrap or iron ore or other things that are used in the manufacturing of steels, and when China really slowed down, this ability to pivot and be able to load containers really provided quite a windfall for a lot of the minor bulkers.
Now, I understand that recently this has kind of disappeared from the market, these spillover cargoes, I believe with port congestion and China kind of clearing up. Would you agree that that's kind of finished now, or do you expect that that might happen again in the future?
I think it's finished now for two reasons. One, because the congestion is often container ships are once again having deep discounts into their rates in the containers. The only ones you'll see are the ones that are contractually obligated. We are still seeing some, especially coming into the U.S. West Coast from Asia into Everett and LA and Long Beach, but they're pretty few and far between. And the other reason why I would say we probably won't see it in the future is one thing that we always look at is the order book. So we're always looking at the horizon to see how many new ships are coming in whatever sector. And for the foreseeable future, the main glut coming out of the shipyards are container ships. So we don't see this supply and demand issue being in play again in the near future. However, nobody saw COVID and saw the port congestion coming. Maybe perhaps the zero COVID policy or something else similar to this came up, we would see that kind of pressure on the container market again, but they are definitely upending their supply issues that they had by having all these new builds rolling out.
Certainly. Now, kind of switching over to what's going on around the world, of course, geopolitical tensions are high with the conflict in Ukraine. And one of the big stories for dry bulk has been the shifts in ton-mile demand. And I'm curious with minor bulks if you've seen any impact from the conflict in Ukraine.
Initially, yes. I'd say almost immediately we were seeing a lot of strange routes popping up. So, for example, we have a client who produces soda ash in Bulgaria, and they were suddenly needing to move coal from Colombia. And what would that look like, and what would their rates be, and trying to plan forward because they needed it to run their factories. We also had some interesting inquiries for agripods going into Kazakhstan. So that was creating a real issue because of all the intermodal. They were considering going into the Black Sea if we could get an owner to go there, or into China. So I would say what we saw was a very little cargo going into West Africa, which was a lot of fertilizers and grains out of Ukraine and Russia going to West Africa, and some very different routes than we had seen previously coming out of the Americas. Because of the time of year that the conflict began, that wasn't really affecting the U.S. agricultural market as much, being in the spring, right, because our seasons happen later. Definitely, we were seeing more cargoes moving out of East Coast South America in the grains into West Africa and to Asia, where maybe typically they would have been purchasing out of the Black Sea. We also saw where minor bulkers who were willing to go there were making 3 times the market value of the vessel.
Oh, is that right?
Yes. And that is still, actually, I would say that's just recently backed off. So let's say a Supermax is worth, it's open in the East Mediterranean, is worth $17,000 a day on the market. If willing to call the Black Sea, they would be seeing $35,000 to $40,000 a day for that same vessel.
Wow, that's an impressive jump.
Yes. So those willing, and their clubs and their insurers that were willing to allow them to do that were able to benefit from that situation. But there were many owners that had initially said and continue to say, no, we're not going to call the Black Sea for now.
Yeah, I can understand with insurance concerns. It's an extremely difficult situation.
Mm-hmm. I think now that it's more ships have come in and out, the appetite for that risk is growing.
Well, initially with grain, one of my questions for you was if the U.S. Gulf, and this is a more recent situation with the Mississippi River, the low water levels, which is delaying grain cargoes from being able to make it downriver. Very first, I'm curious what effects you've seen from the barge delays on the Mississippi.
Sure. So a lot of those grain cargoes, especially on the larger vessels, the Panamaxes, Capsarmaxes, those are on COAs, as well as many others in the minor sizes, in the supras and ultras, and even down to the handings. So the risk is really on the ship owner and the terminal in those cases. We saw a lot of force majeure hit, so that's a lever within all contracts, if there's things that are out of your control, to basically say we can't perform. Either the suppliers say they can't perform, or the charters who chartered the boats say they can't perform because the grain can't get there. Or more likely, and I think more of what we saw, is a commercial understanding began to happen after all the force majeure started being claimed. So there is still cargo moving. It's moving a lot more slowly, and the barges are short-loaded. And so that's really on the grain houses who are going to be absorbing most of those costs, and the vessel owners who are sitting there. If force majeure is called and they've been sitting there, let's say 10 days waiting for cargo, and the charters say, this is out of our control and we're not going to pay the demurrage for the vessel sitting there. So I think that probably some lawyers are going to make some money off of this, but there was a little bit of a hysteria initially, and it seems like it's calmed down, which tells me that a lot of commercial decisions were made and negotiated behind the scenes to help everybody get through this. And the rains are coming, and I think that it's improving as well on the river.
Interesting.
However, that did push the Chinese and other Asian countries more towards East Coast South America as a supplier. And that's true with the Black Sea as well, because they're looking for more stability and reliability. So the issues that we had with the river and congestion and the issues with the conflict in the Black Sea, that has, and what really started with the Trump era trade wars, sort of pushed those relationships down to South America, out of Asia. So I would say, as much as they can produce, Asia is willing to purchase.
Interesting.
It's been a more stable market for those receivers.
So what is it about stability versus the quality of the grain, or what the buyer specifically is looking for? Why is that favored specifically?
Well, the quality will always come into play, especially with soybeans, with the beans market and the protein. Well, all agropods. There's protein levels. There's all kinds of things that folks are looking for when they're milling or crushing. The Argentinians and the Brazilians have come a long way in improving all of those levels and are getting closer and closer to Black Sea and U.S. Gulf levels of quality. And every time something like this, some disruption happens, as you all know, and people in these industries know, it takes a long time to build a relationship between the supplier and a receiver. And it takes a very little time to kind of unspool those relationships, unfortunately. And once they start purchasing from someone else and have a relationship that they're developing with another country or entity or a supplier, it's really hard to claw that back. Now, there are things that are very specific, and you can only get out of certain markets because it's grown in certain places. Ag is unique in that way. But I would say if the protein levels are close, if the quality is close, and it's a lot more reliable and less expensive, both in the commodity as well as the freight, then obviously the receivers, the buyers, are gonna head that direction, which for the last few years has definitely been South America, East Coast South America.
Interesting. One of the commodities I've seen that has really exploded in comparison to past exports out of Brazil has been unmilled rice to Mexico. I was curious if you had heard about this. I believe there was a situation where the Mexican government had waived some kind of import tariffs, and this allowed Mexican importers to switch from U.S. Gulf rice to Brazilian and Argentinian as well. And I think the numbers are just astronomically higher than what in the past these countries had exported. I'm curious if you think we'll see more of Argentina, more of Brazil kind of branching out into other markets and taking more market share in the future.
Definitely believe that's the intention, and they have the ability to grow all these crops. So I'm not as familiar with the milled rice, just to full disclosure, although I have moved cargoes of rice for years out of the U.S. Gulf into Mexico. And I will say that we've seen people try and have it make sense to even prior to the conflict bring in grains from the Black Sea because the grains themselves are less expensive, but the freight kills it. And I would imagine that at some point that would be the same case with the milled rice into Mexico. It's a 3-day duration from the Mississippi River into Veracruz, Tampico, the places 3 or 4 days where where those receivers are. So perhaps they are, in order to get in, having a good sale on their milled rice coming in. But I don't see any reason why Argentina and Brazil would not be trying to break into additional agricultural markets. They started really strongly with soybeans and corn and now milled rice. So it makes sense to me that they would try. For some of those markets, then I would say coming back into Mexico, that kind of surprises me. Going to Asia, it would make sense.
Interesting.
But now that they're really purchasing a lot of milled rice, it would be mostly for the Americas. So yeah, it's an interesting development.
Yeah, I was surprised to see it. I was surprised to see. I'd never considered that Mexico has a lot of rice mills apparently. So that's an interesting aspect to it. But yeah.
Well, and Mexico, they also import a lot of corn for not for tortillas. They use their domestic corn, and they are a big exporter of white corn out of Mexico, especially West Coast Mexico. And they import yellow corn from the States primarily for industrial baking, for Corona beer, for an industrial starch. So they bring in a lot of corn and rice out of the States, but they're used in different ways. But they are a big miller, for sure.
Interesting. Yeah. I never knew this grain industry specifically was a big part of my one of my favorite beers. So that's exciting to hear.
Yeah, there you go. Right. So next time you try that Corona, just think about U.S. corn going down there.
It's exciting stuff. But now with the Panama Canal, I know that recently the wait times for Neo-Panamax logs have really jumped up. I'm curious if you've seen this affecting the Kamsarmax market. The larger Panamax, maybe carrying grain out of the U.S. Gulf?
Yeah, I don't know if it would definitely. The thing with some of this stuff is a little bit more slow moving. I don't think it's so much about demand, but more about how owners would be contemplating forward and spot cargoes and how they would be rated. So as much as we try to look in a crystal ball constantly when we're looking at forward rates, and that means if someone says, okay, I need 8 cargoes of a Kamsarmax of corn out of the U.S. Gulf into Asia, to Japan, let's say, what would that rate be? So if you look at what's happening now, you look at what's happening typically, and seeing any kinds of delays in the Panama Canal, I would say everyone at minimum always adds 3 days on either side of calling the canal. And when you see something like 14, 10, all these other days, or having to auction for a slip, then you're going to increase that, especially for anything that's happening fourth quarter or first quarter of 2023. And definitely for spot. So I don't know, maybe it would change demand and then it would make it too expensive, and then the receivers would pivot to East Coast South America. But most of those that are moving are on long-term contracts, so it's just a risk that is borne by the owner.
Sure.
And then thought about after they've felt that pain the next time they go to rate the business, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Well, with the extended wait times with the U.S. Gulf and then the fees to use the canal in the first place, what would motivate, let's say, an Asia Pacific buyer of grain to choose the U.S. Gulf over the North Pacific, maybe closer to your office there?
Typically, the commodity is less expensive coming out of the Gulf. Also, so for the grains, primarily the wheat that comes out of the NOPAC is a completely different kind of wheat. It's soft or hard white, and that is preferred in milling the Asian products of noodles and lighter pastries and things that need a lighter color. And the rail to get it, even though the PNW is notorious, the Columbia River, for being very, very expensive, which it is, the rail to get it and the commodity coming this direction from where that's grown, which is primarily in the PNW, maybe out to Idaho-ish. It's a specialized cargo, so that's always coming out of here. It doesn't make any sense to send it into the Gulf. The Gulf also, we still do have quite excellent agricultural products and things that the wheat that's coming out of the U.S. Gulf is still desired around the planet. So it's not like it's going to be replaced anytime soon. But usually the cost that people are looking at, it's more about the type that's coming out of the PNW. However, we have seen some rail disruption because of the barging issue in the Mississippi, where some ag is being tried to be railed to the NOPAC to have it come out of here. And I haven't seen a lot of it. I think those were more initial urgent demands. It seems like it's been tapering off, but I know that our rail for copper concentrates and soda ash were delayed due to the rail companies because the ag people were willing to pay a higher price to move their cargo that they couldn't get onto barges via rail and into the NOPAC.
Interesting.
Or down into Texas and different ports in the New Orleans into Louisiana that they couldn't do on barges. So it was a scramble to try and get, because the other thing that you have to remember too when there's these kinds of delays, right? Agricultural products, they get mold, they only have a certain amount of shelf life, and if they had to get them moving or get them off of barges into rail and et cetera before it was a total loss.
Right.
So, but traditionally, in a normal market, the U.S. Gulf has its red, hard winter wheats, the red wheats that come through there, and then the NOPAC is the white wheats. I mean, it's a little bit more. We could get really into weeds, but that's sort of the simple way to look at it.
Sure.
And then certain soybeans come out through here too. So the soybeans that are grown in North Dakota come through here, through the Pacific Northwest versus through the Gulf. And that's just intermodal cost savings.
Well, to go back just a little bit to what you talked about with the U.S. grains out of NOPAC for the North Pacific, I remember seeing a few fixtures maybe a couple of weeks ago that I think were exactly that. They were listed as North Pacific fixtures for U.S. Gulf grain, and I couldn't really wrap my head around that, but I think I got a clearer picture now.
Yes, exactly.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
Well, we've spoken quite a bit about grain. I'm curious with the minor bulks, if you've seen any changes in thermal fuels instead, something like maybe petcoke or so on.
Yeah, we've seen a big increase especially off the U.S. West Coast into the Asia markets of petcoke. I would say I'd be interested to run a report to see just how much, but it feels like that is a consistently growing market. And I think that there was a lot of petcoke that wasn't. I think it's also due to the conflict that it's being absorbed out of the West Coast by Asia. So they are looking for other markets of petcoke to run their factories.
Right.
That's what and a lot going into India out of the U.S. Gulf as well. That would be a lot of ultras carry pet coke into India and Panamaxes as well. And I would say it's primarily handy super ultras off the West Coast taking pet coke into Asia, but we've seen a big increase in that.
Interesting. And these Panamaxes, are these the special geared Panamaxes I've heard about, or just regular Panamaxes?
No, mostly just regular Panamaxes. It just depends on ultimately the receiving port, what they can do. And the geared Panamax is almost a little bit of a unicorn now. They were sort of in favor, but I would say no one's been building those consistently for a while, so they tend to be older tonnage and unusual. So they were probably built and spec'd for a specific project at the time, and then have been sold in the secondhand trade and are traded. But they're usually kind of a project boat. So
sure. I like that idea of a unicorn Panamax. Interesting when you see one.
Yeah, every once in a while someone will say we need a geared Panamax. I'm like, we do need to rethink our program because they're very hard to find. But the Ultramaxes just keep getting bigger. I think there's a lot of 66,000 dead weight Ultramaxes out there now. They can't go through the old locks, but also we were talking about Panama. Obviously doesn't make a lot of sense for like greed going to Asia, but we were looking at steels out of East Coast Brazil into the West Coast of the U.S. and wherever and whenever right now you can just go around Cape Horn instead of dealing with the Panama Canal. It can actually be economical because daily hire rates have come off probably 40%, and fuel bunkers are down as well. So it's starting to have that math problem of Panama Canal, the fees to go through, the delays there versus going around, and a lot of times it's making more sense to go around.
Yeah.
And that's probably the other way people are contemplating. Same thing with the Suez that happened. It's really just an algebra equation to figure out which way is best. And especially now that for a while there when ships were trading in the 30s, 40s, $50,000 a day, it wouldn't make sense. And when bunkers were at $1,000 per metric ton for very low sulfur fuel oil. But now that's all come off. So it's once again looking at sailing around.
Absolutely. Yeah, I saw that some of that with Capesize front hauls going through Suez, where that long voyage round actually ends up with a lower dollar a ton, rate. So pretty interesting stuff. I imagine there are situations where someone needs something just as soon as possible, whatever the cost, which would have them still running through the canals. But yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah.
Now, with the Brazilian steel, that's pretty interesting. It sounds like it's something that you folks really look at. Have you noticed any changes in that market? I know that Chinese steel making has really dropped off. Has that been the same for these Brazilian steel cargoes?
Yes, I would say, and for us, our importer is, they're buying it and then doing some manufacturing to it. And the domestic demand was down, so they weren't bringing it in as frequently as they hoped. And then tariffs come into play. There's a lot of different things, but I do see the slabs market out of Brazil consistently being circulated. So it seems to be robust. I haven't noticed that it's come off.
These are coming out of Brazil. Who's picking up these cargoes?
That's a great question. I only know of my clients.
Sure.
But that's something I can circle back with you.
Oh, absolutely.
I would imagine if I were to go look at the orders, I'm sure a lot of it's going into Europe.
I suppose that would make sense. Huh?
Yeah. But I was really focused on what was coming into America. And also there's steels that come out of West Coast Mexico, so they get it in some form, and then some sort of milling or manufacturing is happening to it, and it's being exported or used domestically. So it's not it's maybe putting it into taking slabs and making it into rebar.
I see.
So, and actually quite a bit of steel slabs moves out of West Coast Mexico into the Gulf. That's a really consistent player as well. But those would all be small, minor bulkers.
Sure.
Small stems of 30,000 tons, say, of slabs.
Oh, absolutely. What would this be? Handy size levels? Handy max?
Yes. Handy, and I would say out of Brazil, that would be the Supermax and Ultramaxes.
Gotcha.
But definitely geared. You have to have geared vessels to load and discharge the steels.
Yeah, I've seen some interesting things. I don't know if you do much with, and this, getting into minor bulks, this might be a minor bulk, but like logs, wood logs. I've seen some very interesting YouTube videos of Supermaxes, maybe Handy Maxes, loading logs straight off the side of the port there. And they built up kind of a trellis around the outside of it. There's a word for it, and I can't remember, where they can actually stack it up on the deck itself with these cables kind of forming an additional cargo hold once the holds are filled.
Correct. Yeah, watching the logs being loaded is a pretty traumatic bulk experience. Logs and scrap are probably the two. And prior to working at Pacific Rim Shipbrokers, I worked for a company called San Juan Navigation, and I was the commercial vessel operator, so I got to go and attend all those fun loadings. So yes, the log, it is a dramatic, and I'm so glad that there's YouTube videos. It's a pretty amazing puzzle that they do. It's sold as a lump sum cargo, and I definitely wouldn't want to cross the North Pacific on one of those ships because I have a feeling it'd be pretty rough. But they do it all the time on those, and definitely need a geared vessel for that as well.
That's fascinating to think about a ship that small in comparison to these larger, these Kamsarmaxes, these capesizes, crossing the ocean. You know, it's
right.
Like you said, it's a little terrifying, but.
Yeah, and when you see the big ones being tossed around, I mean, we love seeing the YouTube videos of all the different bulkers crossing. It's always interesting.
Absolutely.
But we have noticed an uptick of, so one sign, I mean, everybody's waiting for China, right, to turn the lights back on.
Sure.
Essentially, for the miners and the majors. So the iron ore that would go in, so then you're back into the major bulkers in the steel production. This is going to be the thing that everybody's really watching with China. They're always going to be bringing in ag, and they're trying to develop their own ag. But the steel production is really what pushes a dry bulk around. Whether it's the coal to feed the factories and the scrap and the iron ore to build the steel, it's really a major component of what supports the entire market. So I think everyone is assuming still continued contraction or just a flat market out of China, at least through their new year, which is earlier this year, which is good. And maybe some relaxing of the zero COVID policy. So I think everyone's waiting till post-Chinese New Year to really see what's going to happen there. And with like fingers crossed behind their back that it will loosen up the COVID policies and start booming up the housing market there and overall infrastructure, so that the demand for steel and the products that go into making it increase in China by second quarter of next year. But I think it's not going to be what we saw before, but I think that's what everybody's hoping to see.
Oh, sure. You know, if you attend these various panels, these conferences, looking at the dry bulk industry, it felt like each quarter you could hear the ship owners kind of talking about China as if, wistfully, you know, I imagine any week now they'll turn that faucet back on, but it's been slow, you know, after the COVID restrictions and, slow opening back up these different steel factories, so.
Absolutely. I will say if you want to find optimists for that next quarter is going to be better, just need to call a ship owner, someone in chartering. It is always going to be better next quarter. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Eternal optimist. It's a great way to be. But very good. So we've talked a little bit about some of these different minor bulks, some grains, some thermal fuel. I was curious if you had any kind of last thoughts, or if there was anything you wanted the chance to share during this time.
I think maybe the last bit about China. I do know what I'd like to share. So,
okay.
And this may be getting a little bit too inside baseball, but a good indicator of things returning to a little bit of a normal market, which in some ways is better for everyone because all parties can anticipate what they're going to be paying and what things are costing. When we had the COVID restrictions and the flip-flop of the markets with containerized vessels, and suddenly the Pacific was so expensive and a market to be at, and nobody wanted to be in the Atlantic. So basically the front haul became the back haul, and the back haul became the front haul, and then everything was a front haul. Everything was expensive, no matter what direction you were going. There was no discount. We have really seen that. It didn't flip back immediately, but it is definitely back to a more normal, reliable market in the idea that you will ballast a dry bulk ship from the Far East to the West Coast to get cargo, and you'll absorb that cost, and then off of the West Coast of all the Americas is a front haul. And we're seeing that where before, when we were contemplating that business, you would think of taking a vessel from the West Coast that's already here, and that's not happening anymore. And I would say that's just that whole mindset. And I was talking to an owner that has over 300 ships yesterday, and they said as a company, they are now calculating, and this is speaking a little bit globally, of course, everything is a little bit different, but
sure,
that they are back to thinking of the Pacific as the weaker market and the Atlantic as the stronger market, and basing their calculations in the way that they're contemplating business back on how things were circa 2019.
Interesting.
So I would say that bodes well for the commodity players as well as the owners to have a little bit more stability. I mean, everyone wants some volatility in a market, but when it's that difficult, when your clients, when our trained clients who import into the Philippines are paying 6 times they ever have for their wheat and 3 times for freight, it's untenable at a certain point. So having things calm down a bit and become more predictable, I think, and will be great for everybody, and on the kitchen table as well, or when you go to buy a piece of furniture or a car. So.
Yeah, I imagine there's, I want to say maybe billions of people who are hoping for the same right now, for things to calm down a little bit, So.
Yeah, exactly. And how dry bulk is the canary in the coal mine, and especially I'd say the minor bulkers, because we see things happening before they roll out, and the canary is still singing, and I think it's like just more calm now. So that will bode well for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, I want to thank you again very much, Kelle. Thanks for talking with me today. I feel like I've learned a lot in the last 30 minutes or so here.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate the opportunity, Ross. It's been a real pleasure.
Oh, thank you again. Take care.